My name is Paul Bernstein. I live in Boston in the United States. And the presentation that we will see this morning actually began in what used to be called Czechoslovakia, not in Boston. I was inspired by the Prague Spring. I was here at that time, before the invasion. And then I came back 6 months afterwards for 6 months to live in Prague and to talk to people to try to understand where the political culture had come from. How did this thing emerge that was so nonviolent but so comprehensive, so that the public began pushing the rulers to make reforms a lot faster and a lot more elaborately than the initial expectations of Dubček and the other leaders at the time had been. And this is what scared Brezhnev, and as we all know, the democratization process was halted and suppressed and a lot of people hurt. But I saw people behaving in ways and using a mentality of participation, of the main principle that cooperativism enshrines and tries to foster in its organizations. Democratic dialogue, decision-making, deliberation. I saw it to a degree I had not seen it in Boston. I had not seen it in America. And so I, as a social scientist, I was studying both sociology and political science, asked myself, where did it come from? And I want to find out in depth. I don't want to take simple answers that don't really explain the dynamics. And as a result, one of the areas that I decided to concentrate on was seeing where democracy works inside workplace organizations. Even in capitalist countries where, for one reason or another, whether it came from the co-op movement or it came from a private owner of a family who was about to retire and decided he would rather somehow have his employees own the firm after he left. But again, he didn't know how to do democracy, he just had the ideal. I found many, many cases that differed in the ways they were experimenting with trying to develop democracy in the workplace. And by analyzing the failures and the successes, and by success I meant something that lasted for 10, 15 years and was a well-functioning business for financial reasons as well as in terms of the democracy, 6 components emerged as absolutely essential for the success. There were many democratic workplaces that had more than 6 components that seemed important to them. But what I discovered by continuing to compare them across 15 different countries, 50 different cases, was that these 6 were essential. If any one of these 6 was missing, sort of like the vital organs of the human body, we could say, oh, I'm very healthy, 80% of my organs are working fine. But if the other 20% is a heart, or a stomach, or a lung, or both lungs, those are vital, you're going to die anyway. And this is what these 6 are, the kind of vital, not structures, but really processes, vital functions. In democratic workplaces, profit-making companies, and especially relevant, therefore, to cooperatives and worker cooperatives. Now, it's a list, and it doesn't make much sense as a list. I'll just read them through because I'm not sure how clear it is, and then what I'll do is show you how they affect each other. They are all essential together, partly because each single component seems to need the inputs from the other processes. And they support each other at the same time. Each one that functions well encourages the individual willingness to participate, which is what I was referring to when Theo was talking earlier. He was talking about why people might withdraw from participation, why they would feel ostracized, why they would feel not paid attention to. And that turns out to be related to one of the 6. And so we'll go to a flow diagram, but first I'll read these and explain very quickly what they are. Worker participation in the management level decision making, that's obvious. That's almost the definition of what workplace democracy means. But the structures have to be clear, and the processes have to be safe, and they have to be encouraged and supported. The second is a frequent feedback of varying economic results to all employees. Now, in some companies that aren't on the co-op model, they still have what they call profit sharing. And that's one form of this. But I noticed that frequency was as important as what came through the channel. And we'll talk more about that and how that affects the members' motivation. Number 3 is full sharing with employees of management level information and, to an increasing extent, management level expertise. For the word employees, we can use the word co-op members there. Full sharing is very different from people feeling like they need some background information on a policy. Let's say these are a board in a worker co-op, and most of them were elected from the membership, and so they haven't had management backgrounds. But they know that if there's a question of a large investment in new equipment, for instance, if it's a production co-op, they want to make sure that they're going to choose that source of equipment from a reliable vendor. And so they're going to want some information. And if that information is held in the office of the professional managers, if it's a kind of co-op that hires a few professional managers, and that information either isn't released in full, or when it's released to the worker board members, it's not clear enough to them, then again, there's going to be dangerous consequences to the whole democratic future. The 4th one is called guaranteed individual rights, which corresponds, as it turns out, to the basic civic political liberties. In other words, people have to feel in a democratic enterprise that it's safe for them to propose an alternative to some existing policy, because there's other people in the cooperative who identify with the existing policy and either don't want change or feel that their sponsorship and defense of that existing policy in the past is going to make them look incapable now or embarrassed or somehow mistaken. And it has to be safe for the truth to come out. And a list of rights is the beginning of that, but it's not sufficient. So the 5th component that was necessary is an independent board of appeal in case of a dispute. And different co-ops can handle that in different ways. If it's a small co-op, sometimes the independent appeal board is everyone else in the cooperative. If it's a larger cooperative, or if it's a chain of cooperatives, then they may have set up a panel of 3 elected, almost like judges, to hear cases of disputes. If someone feels that I didn't get promoted 6 months when I expected it, but I do remember that I said some things at the last meeting that might have offended some of the board members, maybe that's not why. And I want to make sure that I'm not being penalized unfairly for that. And then the 6th component, which is the one as a researcher, I felt I wasn't going to be able to grapple at all, had to do with mentality and consciousness, so I tried to avoid it over and over again. And that's why it's 6th, because I still found out it was one of the vital organs. And we've talked a lot about people's motivations, and sometimes when a company is newly made into a co-op, again, for instance, it's brought under what were previously employees situation. Now they're the owners. In Argentina, for instance, where there were many companies that failed during the decline of the economy, and the workers saw there was no place that was going to hire them because places kept closing, so they decided to try to take over ownership and learning. Then the consultants come in and they say, well, the new owners need to develop an ownership culture. They need to feel as owners. That's one aspect of this political, participatory democratic consciousness, but it's just one, and we'll talk about some more that emerged from the research. Now I have to switch to a different program, and then we'll start going through these in detail as a diagram. Good. Okay, that says interaction of the components. And as I said, one of the main reasons why these 6 emerged and function as crucial is that they each depend on each other. So now we're going to show the system flows. The first thing is that, I hope you can, no, I guess it's too far away. I'll read these to you. Keep track of the colors though, because they are a guide to this. The blue box is stating a condition. And then there will be a green circle if that component is actually in place. So the first one that we listed at the top as the participation in getting your views into the democratic decision-making process. Does that exist, and does it exist reliably? If it does, which is what the blue is asking, then the green circle says, yes, it exists. Then there'll be the need for something else. If people are finding that they're participating in decision makings in a profit-making company and it's achieving improvements in productivity and in profits, they want to share in that. And if they're co-op members, that's their right, that's their ownership. So that's what the second component is asking. Are there tangible rewards to the participant for his or her extra effort in co-governing and for the benefits that accrue to the company? And if that is in place, then that component, the green circle, comes. And as I said, a frequent return is important, and if there's time or during the question period, we'll talk about why. The third component, there's a need or a desire for more information from management level sources. Is that then made available? If yes, fine, the component exists. The fourth condition, are there guarantees to protect critical speech and organizing among the employees? Is there a written guarantee? Is there some safety that people can hope for? If yes, okay, that component is present. In case of reprisal or dispute, is there a trustworthy system for fair appeal? That's the fifth question and condition in the blue box. And if that exists, fine, we have 5 of the 6 components. Now, what happens is the 6th component, which is this one about psychology, the individuals and the group's mentality, their skills, their traits. I will go into those in greater detail a little later. That is what gets affected by the 5 of these. So I'm now going to show you some feedbacks. There's a line that you can see from component 2 going up, and it reaches the main lever in all of this. It says high individual willingness to participate. Underneath that, there's a red hexagon which says low or none. First, I'm going to show you how that individual willingness to participate, feeling involved, feeling like it's worth speaking up, seeing the results, being motivated to participate more is one cycle from each of the components. But later on, we'll get to the bad news, which is when that willingness to participate is discouraged. As Theo was talking about, the ostracism, the sense of being left out, of not being included, not being heard. And each one of these will have a little hexagon. It'll become understandable as I go through it. So we have a feedback that when component number 2, which is there's some kind of tangible reward, there's profit sharing, there's dividends, we feel that we're co-owners and we can see the results of our activity and it's being shared with us, well, this is fine. This is what the satisfaction statements that came out in some of the research from the different reports. From the Polish one, I remember that being reported. So from component number 3, when there's a need for information it's given, that increases the individual's willingness to participate. The arrow goes around and increases the higher willingness. And there's another. The feedback from number 4, though, do I have rights that are going to guarantee freedom here, that I'm protected? It doesn't immediately satisfy people's willingness. They want to then ask, and who's going to protect me if I don't think it's happening well? So that brings on the demand for the 5th component, the independent source of appeal. But then when that goes in favor of someone who felt unjustifiably perhaps penalized, even if it was indirect, then they resume confidence in saying, okay, I'll risk participation next time. Now, here's where the bad news comes in. If, in this case, the need or desire for more information in order to put together an important proposal or to make a decision before the board of the co-op, if it's not available or it's available in a way that is not digestible for the members, then what I show here is they'll at least start with feeling resentment. All right, they promised us, this is supposedly our company. We want to make these decisions based on being satisfied that we know the possible consequences. We need this data for that, and what they gave us is not enough. So there's resentment. And after a while, it builds, and there's this apathy. It's not worth it. I'm just not going to bother. I mean, I'll show up at the meetings, but I'm not going to say anything. And Eva was asking earlier, how do we encourage people who've already felt a little bit ostracized to be brought back into it? And this is part of the reason those problems occur. If component 4, the guarantees aren't shown clearly from the beginning when a person first becomes a member of a co-op, there's going to be fear, and that will reduce. That goes to low or none in terms of their willingness to participate. So red means stop like the traffic lights, and green means go into the subconscious of the participant in the system. And if there is no Board of Appeals, in case of a dispute, then the person's at least going to be cautious. It doesn't mean they'll quit because they say, well, the rights are guaranteed to us, but I have to figure out how to do this in the least risky way. And meanwhile, while they're cautious, they're not going to participate as much openly in the decision-making or in the proposal-making. So what happens is, as it keeps being reinforced, this willingness to participate, the high thing, then encourages a dynamic on this side of the screen, and I've only isolated them for the sake of understanding. You don't have to worry about what's on which side. But on the side that we're going to look at now has to do with the feedbacks in terms of their actual participation. So there's an arrow that comes out of high and goes around component 1, which is representing yourself, and it says in the gray box, participation is attempted. And then if it's adopted, the particular proposal, there's a kind of counter that's going on, a memory bank. We're storing it up. The first time, that's wonderful. It goes through the memory. We're happy. There's an intrinsic reward of success, which is what's written in that green thing. And then that feeds back right away around and increases my willingness to participate. I finally spoke up. They listened to me. People voted in direction of it. They may have modified the proposal, but you know, I'm happy. I'm willing to participate more the next time. Now I'm going to skip through a few because I want to show what happens if it doesn't get adopted. All right, the red hexagon that comes out of that same gray circle where participation was attempted but it's not adopted, that goes to the negative side of our memory. All right, the first time it's not a disaster. The arrow that says first time, it goes to frustration. At least we're upset, but we're not running away yet. But if we go around that cycle and several times in the counter we've done participation and it's not been adopted, many times then we begin to get cynical. And again, that feeds into apathy. That shows that our willingness to participate lowers. And this, again, is that ostracism problem. Okay, the others I'm not going to bother with right now, and the machine won't let me go backwards to it anyway. So let me go further on. There's one more thing. I mentioned that the big area in the middle into which everything is feeding, the lever that's so crucial in our motivation within a democratic situation or one that's offering democratic opportunities, is this participatory democratic consciousness. And so we've been showing just one element of that, which is our willingness to participate. So I put in a gray area which says there are other elements of consciousness. And now I want to move to that. And you'll excuse me, that takes us back to the other program. I didn't say it explicitly enough before, so I should say it now while I'm pausing. Each of these arrows, each of these generalizations about what motivates people and dismotivates people did not come out of imagination. These all came out of cases. Sometimes a case of a particular firm that had been set up with a lot of idealism, with a lot of democracy guaranteed and all of that, eventually decayed. And the only report, because I was relying on a lot of secondary reports from different countries, mentioned failure of not sharing enough management level information. And so I kept track, even if it didn't talk about all 6 of them, we learned about the 6 from looking at 50 different cases, from different cultures, from different self-descriptions. Some didn't use the word democracy, they only used the word participation. And all of this is in the book that's the full study, and I have copies if people would be interested. So you can see each one has a footnote to it. It was really data-based. My desire as a social scientist was not to come from a narrow ideology, but to really let the data teach us what is the life of democracy in a co-op or other forms of worker-owned firms. Now, here's the consciousness component. And what emerged here was, again, from the data, very surprising. Normally, you can think of human behavior on any particular trait, like willingness to participate, or ability to generalize, or ability to listen, acceptance of new ideas, or resistance of that. A lot of our behaviors can be displayed on a kind of continuum. We either have a lot of it or we have very little of it. Or some things are opposite. I either have flexible thinking or I have rigid thinking. And rigidity would be one end of the spectrum and flexibility would be the other end. So I assumed, okay, I'll be making from the data a list of traits, and there'll be these nice spectrums going in one direction and then back to, from the negative and the positive from the point of view of what works for democracy. And instead I got 2 sets of opposites. So in the middle of this chart you see 2 columns, but you notice that a lot of the labels, and I'll go into those in a moment, the text crosses over the boundary. These 2 are sort of shared. But then we have an opposite end of the spectrum on the left side. Those little bars in the middle should have been drawn as much longer lines so you'd see them spectrums. And on the right side, there's opposites. And what it turned out to be was, of course, but I didn't know that until I asked myself, why is the data doing this to me? How do I make sense of it? When we're a member of a cooperative or a democratic community, we are actually in 2 possible positions, and both of them are legitimate. One is, as a kind of citizen in the state, we're usually relating to the outputs of somebody else's governing decisions. So the set on the left side, the 2 columns on the left, and their spectra are how we relate to or react to the outputs of the managing process. Now, in a company, we can be part of the managing process. And that's the whole point of a co-op and other democratic workplaces. So there's another set of columns and another set of spectra, which has to do with our behavior as we relate to the inputs of offering proposals, of being on the board of directors, or if it's a work team, of being in the decision-making team meeting. And it turns out that for participatory consciousness to be healthy, the positive ends of both of those behaviors, the way I react to demands or commands that come down from the governing decisions, and the way I initiate to participate in and shape the governing decisions, both require certain things, and that's what's listed in the middle. A crucial one of them is critical thinking. In both cases, if I'm reacting to the outputs of the governing process, I'm either going to be not able to do much critical thinking, in which case I'm easily manipulated, and we see this every election in any country, how certain politicians know how to make us fearful, how to make us stop thinking, and just run away to them and vote for them, even if we don't know what they're going to do, because they've made us afraid of somebody else, the opponent. Critical thinking, though, of course, is also needed when I'm participating as part of the input to the managing process. If I'm one of 5 people in the co-op who's a subcommittee that's been delegated with the task of researching several options in terms of new marketing or in terms of vendors to buy our materials from and stuff, I need to be able to not think simplistically or be made afraid of one option and just run to the other. I have to be able to evaluate things on several levels. I have to realize that there's probably 5 things we have to think about, and it's not an either or. We have the word multiple causation there is one. To analyze in depth, to have a long time sense, not to just make decisions that we're looking at the short term. And again, I know it's not really optimum for it all to be on a wall on a slide, so it's in the book and it's easy to look at and study. And the opposite of having those positive traits, the opposite ends of the spectrum, are summarized at the very bottom. One's very compliant is what all 7 of those traits sort of summarize as in the first column. If one is easily manipulable as someone receiving the outputs of the decision makers, or one sort of abstains from being involved. A lot of people who just won't vote, even if they have the right to vote. Again, a common concern by researchers in cooperatives. How do we get everyone to participate? What's causing them to abstain from being part of the inputs? Whereas the middle 2 columns, which summarize the various traits that emerged as crucial and very nourishing to democratic participation, are people are activist, they're willing to initiate, they have the courage, they have the confidence, but they also have the intelligence in their way of thinking to make positive proposals that help the firm, and at the same time, in terms of how they react to attempts to manipulate them, they're resistant to manipulation. They're inquisitive. They'll ask questions. Well, you claim this, but show me that that's really true. Where did you get that? Would be an example. So what was helpful to me anyway, emotionally, when this became clear, was that this whole notion of consciousness, which can sound so vague, or the individual aspects of it that might have been mentioned in different cases or in different researchers, now began to make sense as an overall combined system, and yet it was very specific. I mean, the traits here are we can understand and see when someone is being servile or timid, and therefore easily manipulated. We can see, on the other hand, where someone refuses to transfer responsibility as a personal trait and says, okay, I'm a co-owner here, even if this policy proposal is confusing to me, I'm going to talk to some other people to try to find out how we can understand it. So it's very specific behaviors. It focused and brought into clarity what otherwise might have been a vague or shifting description about what participatory democratic consciousness is. And it was derived not only from these 50 companies' experience, the failures who showed people having the behaviors or the traits or the habits on the outside 2 columns, and the successes which showed people having behaviors and traits that you see on the inside 2 columns, but also other studies of democratic culture, because the individual activities are really quite similar, even though it might be a context of an organization versus a municipality, for instance. Well, what's important when we're talking about organizational development, the evolution of a cooperative from the initial stages where very few members might have management confidence and experience to a point where after many, many years there's much more deeper involvement. There are 3 dimensions that are helpful as researchers for measuring the progress of the participation or the lack of progress, but at least coming up with specific measures. And also for the members of a co-op to see their progress and not to assume that they can jump from no knowledge to perfect governance, but to see that they're making progress as they gradually expand. The 3 dimensions are, I'm showing you one of them now, which is called the range of issues over which control may be exercised. In other words, it may be easy for all members of a co-op at the beginning to be at the bottom of this dimension. They can, which says physical working conditions, safety rules and practices, placement in particular jobs, because this is their expertise. They know how their work is done much better than any board of directors knows. And so if the first invitations to participation for people who may not feel they know how to do that. It might have been in Argentina. We knew we had to save our jobs, so we went along with this idea of somehow buying out the failing firm. But then when it comes time to manage it, I don't know how to do long-term strategic planning. But if you ask me, is there a way that we could, as a work team on the factory floor, much more efficiently get product out the door than the way the previous management was having us do it? Oh yeah, I've been storing up those ideas for about 5 years now. That's where they're ready to speak. So this arrangement of issues from the immediate working conditions up through at the very top, the company's long-term goals, can be made in a more organic and natural, pedagogically sensible evolution for the employee or the new owner, by going from their immediate job situation to then going up, let's say, to questions about hiring and training, which certainly were the supervisor's role before. But once I know that you'll listen to me that I wasn't wrong about how we could change the manufacturing process, well then of course I can say, here's where I need training. You know, there's this new thing we saw in a trade magazine that would be a different machine for us to use. But we're going to need training on that. And so yes, we're going to have to budget for that, and we're going to, so it's a natural outgrowth. And then above that, after 6, 12, 18 months on those issues, they might be ready to talk about setting salaries. If it's a co-op that has some professional managers hired at the top, we can evaluate these guys now, you know, because they're used to evaluating themselves. So this dimension was very helpful to see. However, there's another dimension which is operating at the same time, and that's what we called degree of control. In other words, on any of these issues, the question before a democratic enterprise is, well, how much sovereign power will which people have over this decision? In conventional organizations, it's, okay, you are the manager, it's top down, you're the manager of this department, you're responsible, you can veto decisions that are made below. But if it's participatory, maybe on some decisions where, again, the case of, let's say, new owners as a co-op, may feel they want to give advice, which is lower down here, consultation, advisory, but they're not ready to make a decision this year. But after a year and a half of giving advice and seeing what happened, they may be able to move up to co-determination, where it's shared between the professional managers and the worker owners, or move up to sovereignty at the top, where they have total control over that. And again, it's a much more comfortable, humanely organic journeying process into responsibility than suddenly feeling overwhelmed, at which point you may withdraw from participation, even though you're being invited to have a lot of sovereignty. So any decision is going to have a certain amount of degree of control by the rank and file, and which issues, so you have the two dimensions working like a graph, and we don't have time now, but you'll see in the book where I can share with you. Otherwise, you can chart companies. If you're doing research on several different companies and you want to see how different are they, how participatory is this, how participatory is that, it can feel unfair to the researcher to have that all happen on one dimension. But if you can chart which issues or which people making the decisions or participating, if it's not decision, then they're giving advice, but the advice is usually followed, so they're feeling encouraged. And then the third dimension, so unfortunately it's a three-dimensional graph, but that's what the research requires here, is at what level is that happening? Mondragon is a nice example for this, for instance, because although these companies are worker-owned, there was a lot of alienation in some of them at the rank and file level because they weren't participating on decisions on the shop floor. They were electing members to the board of directors. The board of directors would hire the managers. The managers in the biggest co-ops had to be selecting middle managers lower down. So the rank and file were not selecting their immediate supervisor. And Mondragon noticed this and tried to find out from people in conventional but progressive industry, unfortunately. It wasn't a co-op movement that
they found the experts they were looking for. There might have been experts, but in their particular history, they went to people who knew how to increase job enrichment, as it was called, in big corporations like General Motors. So there was some employee participation, but it wasn't selecting the supervisors. So the alienation continued. So the question is not only which issues are people participating in, and what degree of control do they have during their participation over that issue, but what level of the co-op is this happening? In a small co-op, there aren't that many levels, so it tends to sort of collapse, and you can get away with not paying attention to this dimension, but it's, again, very useful to chart all three of those dimensions on each company that you're studying, or on the same company over time, each year. Which issues have now come into much more participation? At what level is that occurring? And it becomes almost like a doctor's diagnostic tool. If we do an annual checkup on these two of the 6 components, we do the one on participation that I'm talking about now, we do an examination in terms of the participatory democratic consciousness with all of those traits that we identified, we get a really strong insight into what the capabilities are now and in the near-term future of that cooperative. And we also get a kind of recipe for remediation. All right, it looks like there isn't enough critical thinking here. How can we help people with that? The best way is to help them by having them do it on the job rather than just teach it to them in a classroom. And again, coming back to my original inspiration of Czechoslovakia, there was a private owner, Tomáš Baťa from Moravia, who created, an empire of shoes and other things, but that's the ones that have survived now from the town of Zlín. And he wasn't ready to democratize his company by giving it away to the employees or letting them elect the board of directors. But he wanted productivity during the 2 recessions, the one that happened in the 20s and the one that happened in the 1930s. And so he said, all right, let's organize each existing workshop into becoming self-accountants. And he had the employees tracking how much material there was coming in, and he taught them the costs. And then he had them track how much went out on a weekly basis. And he said, if you can improve the productivity here, so I can lower the prices of our product, so we can sell more shoes, even though people don't have as much money anymore because it's the depression, then we'll all benefit. And it succeeded fantastically well. He even exported it when he opened up shoe manufacturing factories in Asia, in Malaya, and in India and all of that. Unfortunately, when he was killed in an airplane accident in the late 30s, because he loved to fly airplanes, it was a private plane, he hadn't trained his brother and his son who took over. And they didn't understand and didn't care, and the system now exists nowhere in the Bacha company. I've talked to them, and they sort of whisper over the phone and say, well, the Bacha system is not in place anymore. So that was another important lesson, that democracy as a system, even if it's carefully thought out, even if it's successful, needs continual care and attention. Otherwise, the pressure of the prevailing economic ideology could push it away, and the prevailing culture that people are living in. Now, co-ops, of course, have this advantage that they have an explicitly different culture. So when people go from the workplace to outside culture, which is much less attuned to this in crucial ways, even if it's called a democracy, there are nice tendencies of people to try to export what they've learned in the co-op and how it has changed them into their outside life. But in other companies that are trying democracy, it can happen the other way around. The cultural habits come in and pollute the democracy.